Late mother put this in writing so I'd be looked after. The cottage in Muskoka is already under contract. You have until sundown to clear out your bedroom, or I'm hauling everything to the curb. Sloane's bringing her things up from Toronto on Saturday, so the room needs to be empty before then. That's what my mother's husband said to me on the gravel driveway in Bracebridge, while the funeral home van was still pulling away with the empty casket flowers. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't soften his face. He just shoved a paper at my chest like he was handing me a parking ticket. I looked down. Quitclaim deed, Ontario form, dated the second week of February when my mother had already been intubated for 9 days at Sunnybrook. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be hers, but it was a child's tracing, the loops collapsing into each other, the pen pressing through the paper in some places and floating off in others. Mom signed her name the same way for 40 years. Tight, sloped, the R in her first name like a little wave. This was nothing like that. This was someone trying to remember what a signature looked like at 2 in the morning. Then I glanced past his shoulder, down the long driveway toward the road, and I saw the black Escalade parked under the maples. 2 men in it, one on his phone, one just watching the house. Ontario plates, but the kind of plates you don't write down, you forget on purpose. And it clicked into place the way a deadbolt clicks. My mother's husband wasn't just greedy, he was scared. The men in the Escalade were collectors, and selling my mother's lake house was the only thing standing between him and a quiet drive up some logging road. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just zipped my bag, looked him in the eye, and said, "Enjoy the cottage while you can." Then I walked to my Civic, threw the bag in the back, and drove down to Toronto in the rain. If you've ever had a family member look at you like you were a line item they were ready to write off, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments, what was the exact moment you understood that your value to them had a $sign attached to it? 2 hours later, I was sitting on a borrowed futon in my friend's basement apartment in Parkdale. The kind of basement where the radiator ticks like a metronome and the windows are at sidewalk level so all you see is people's boots. My duffel bag was on the floor, a grocery bag of toiletries beside it. My laptop balanced on a milk crate. That was everything I'd managed to grab before he changed the locks on a house I'd partly grown up in. It was a long way down from the dock at Sturgeon Lake, where my mother had taught me to read the weather off the color of the pines. But the air down here was honest. It smelled like wet asphalt and somebody's curry from upstairs. It didn't smell like wet asphalt and somebody's curry from upstairs. For 7 months, my life had been a loop of the 401 and the parking garage at Sunnybrook. I slept in the recliner beside her bed so often that my left shoulder still won't go all the way back. I was the one writing down the morphine times in a notebook because the night nurse kept getting them mixed up. I was the one paying the property tax and the hydro and the insurance on the cottage out of Mom's account because her husband had stopped doing it months before. Every time I asked him about another $6,000 e-transfer to some numbered company, he'd give me that smile he used at the Rotary Club and tell me I didn't understand asset management. I understood it fine. While I was wiping my mother's mouth with those little pink sponges, he was at Casino Rama feeding her retirement into a baccarat table. Then he brought Sloane around, introduced her at the hospital as a private palliative care companion he'd hired out of pocket, like that made him a saint. She was 31. She wore Lululemon to a hospice. She spent more time in the hallway taking selfies with her coffee than she did in the room. I watched her, that first afternoon, walk through my mother's living room when we'd brought Mom home for what turned out to be the last week. She wasn't looking at the woman in the hospital bed. She was looking at the group of 7 print over the mantel and the silver tea service in the cabinet. The way you look at things at an estate sale when you're trying to decide if you can lowball the dealer. She wasn't a nurse. She was a tenant waiting for a lease to expire. The rage I felt sitting in that Parkdale basement wasn't really about the eviction. It wasn't even about the deed. Not yet. It was about what I'd watched at the cemetery in Bracebridge that morning. He stood at the graveside in his good Harry Rosen overcoat, dabbing his eyes with one of my mother's monogrammed handkerchiefs, accepting hugs from her old friends from the United Church Choir. People kept telling me what a good man he was, how lost he must feel. He nodded along, played his part, accepted the casseroles in his head before they'd even been baked. The second the last car pulled out of the cemetery, the mask came off. He grabbed my elbow hard enough to leave 4 fingerprints on the inside of my arm and hissed, "Stop standing there with that face. You're embarrassing me in front of the Hendersons. They're closing on the lot next door and I need them on side." He was networking at her grave. with her dirt still loose. But that wasn't the moment that broke something inside me. The moment came 10 minutes later. I looked over the headstones, and there was Sloane, standing under one of those golf umbrellas the funeral home hands out, trying to look bereaved. She wore a black wrap dress from Aritzia, and around her neck, sitting heavy against her collarbone, was my grandmother's pearl choker. 2 strands. Akoya pearls, slightly off-round, with the little ruby clasp my grandfather had brought back from a posting in Halifax during the war. My mother had worn that choker on her wedding day in 1986. She had worn it the day she got her doctorate. 3 weeks before she died, she had pressed it into my hand in the hospital and said, "This is yours. When I'm gone, don't let anyone tell you different." I put it back in the velvet box on her dresser at the cottage because I thought it was safer there than in my apartment. He had taken it out of her jewelry box before she was even cold and hung it on his girlfriend like a participation ribbon. That was the second I understood this wasn't grief mismanaged. This was an erasure. He wanted to scrub my mother and me off the property and start a new chapter with a younger woman and a $5 million liquidation sale. He thought taking the house from me would be the thing that finished me. He thought I'd cry on the drive down the 11 and crawl back to ask for a couch in the new arrangement. I sat in that basement and I watched the rain run down the little window, and at some point I stopped crying. I wiped my face on my sleeve. I looked at my laptop on the milk crate and I remembered something he'd never bothered to learn. He thought he ran the cottage because he held the keys. But I was the one who'd installed the smart system 3 summers ago when the break-ins started up around Lake Muskoka. I was the one who'd set up the cameras, paired the locks, written the admin password on a sticky note that I, not he, kept. I opened the laptop. The blue glow was the only light in the room. I went to the portal for the main system and typed in the password. Access denied. Tried again. Slower. Access denied. Of course, he'd had someone change it. He wasn't smart, but he was paranoid enough to lock the obvious door. For a second, I felt my stomach drop. Without that footage, I had a forged signature and a feeling. That's not a case. That's a Reddit post. But then I remembered the quiet system. The summer my mother first started losing weight. Before the diagnosis, I'd noticed Sloane's predecessor, a woman named Carrie, helping herself to my mother's pills and my mother's wine. So I'd quietly installed a second little network, 3 small cameras with audio, tucked inside the bookshelves in the den, 1 inside the smoke detector housing in the master, 1 above the wet bar in the great room. They ran on their own little hub plugged into the cable router. The footage went to a private cloud account in my name. It had been running, untouched, for almost 2 years. He didn't know it existed. Sloane didn't know it existed. I typed in the password, my grandmother's name, and the year Mom was born. Login successful. My hands were shaking, but not the way they'd been shaking all week. I scrolled through the timeline and tapped on the file from the night before the funeral. 11:47 p.m. The den, crystal clear, surround sound through my headphones. There he was, my mother's husband, pouring himself a glass of the Caol Ila she'd been saving for my wedding. Sloane was up on the leather Chesterfield with her shoes off, scrolling on her phone, half a glass of red on the side table. "Are you sure this is going to fly?" she asked. "Lazy, bored. The signature on the deed looks like a kid did it." He laughed. He actually laughed. "It only has to hold for 48 hours, babe. Once the wire hits, we're in Antigua. We pay them, we keep the rest, we figure out the next move from a beach." She rolled onto her stomach. "And the kid? The kid won't even know the cottage is sold until she sees the new boat at the dock. By then, we're gone." He drained his glass. Tarrant called again. "They want every cent by next Friday. They were very clear about what next Friday looks like if they don't get it. So we move. We find a cash buyer who isn't going to ask why a man is selling his dead wife's place 2 weeks after she died. We take whatever we can get over $4 million. We settle with Tarrant, and we disappear." I paused the playback. I sat in the dark with the headphones still on. He had named the lender. He had described the forgery. He had laid out the whole conspiracy. He had done it on tape in a room he thought was his. I could have taken that file to the OPP detachment in Bracebridge the next morning. I could have called my mother's lawyer and asked for an emergency injunction in Superior Court. I could have shut the sale down by Wednesday, but I'd been in a Canadian courtroom before. I'd watched my mother's family fight over my grandmother's estate in 2015, and I knew exactly how it would go. He'd hire a smooth lawyer from one of the Bay Street firms. He'd cry on the stand about a grieving widower making a mistake. He'd say the deed was a misunderstanding, that Mom had nodded yes when he held the pen, that I was a difficult stepdaughter who'd never accepted him. The judge would order mediation. The estate would bleed lawyer fees for 3 years. He'd live in my mother's cottage rent-free the whole time. A civil suit wasn't enough. Stopping him wasn't enough. I needed him to commit something the Crown had no choice but to charge. I needed a real crime, in writing, with a wire, with a closing table, with witnesses. He wanted a cash buyer who wouldn't ask questions. Fine, I would build him exactly that. The next morning, I drove to a small office in a brick walk-up on Bay Street, just south of Davenport. The sign on the door said Holloway and Associates, my mother's lawyer for 22 years, Mr. Wan. Holloway was the kind of Toronto solicitor who still wore 3-piece suits in July and kept a humidor on his credenza. He'd been at every Christmas party my mother ever threw at the cottage. He'd written her will the year she got her diagnosis. I plugged my flash drive into his computer and played him the den footage. By the second minute, the color had drained out of his face. By the fourth minute, the color had come back, and it was the wrong color. He took off his glasses. He rubbed his eyes. "This is grotesque," he said. "We can be in front of a judge by tomorrow morning. We can have the OPP at the cottage by the afternoon. We can have him removed and the listing pulled before he has his coffee on Tuesday." "No," I said. "An injunction just stops him." He wriggles out. He claims he was confused. He claims grief. He cries on a stand. He moved back in and dies of old age in my mother's bed. I leaned forward. "I want him to go through with it, Mr. Holloway. I want him to go through with it, pen in his hand. I want the wire to actually move." Mr. Holloway put his glasses back on. He looked at me for a long second. Then he turned to his credenza and pulled out a thick file, cream-colored, tied with the red string they still use on probate documents in this province. He tapped the file twice with one finger. "You know," he said, "the irony is that he didn't have to do any of this. Your mother knew what kind of man she'd married the second time around. She wasn't blind, but she didn't want him sleeping in a Canadian Tire parking lot either. So she built him a cage with a view." He slid a document across the desk. Her last will, the real one, witnessed, notarized, registered, dated 19 months ago when she was still well. He pointed at Clause 7. Life interest. Read it at Clause 7. Life interest. Read it. I read it. She'd granted him a life interest in the Muskoka property. He had the legal right to live in the cottage, rent-free, until the day he died. The taxes and upkeep would come out of a small trust she'd set up for that purpose. He could fish off the dock for the next 30 years if he wanted to. He just couldn't sell, mortgage, transfer, or encumber the property in any way. And then I saw Clause 8. "Clause 8, Mr. Holloway said, watching my face. "Your mother's idea, not mine. Any attempt by the life tenant to alienate, sell, mortgage, or otherwise transfer title to the property or to misrepresent ownership thereof to any third party shall constitute an immediate and irrevocable forfeiture of the life interest with full title vesting in the named remainder beneficiary. The remainder beneficiary, of course, being you." He looked at me over his glasses. If he had simply lived there, he would have had a roof for the rest of his life. By trying to sell it, he isn't just committing fraud. Under the terms of this will, the very act of putting that property on the market evicts him, automatically. The moment he signs a bill of sale, he ceases to have any right to be on that land. I sat there for a long moment. I thought about my mother in the hospital bed at Sunnybrook, a week before she lost the ability to talk. I thought about her squeezing my hand and saying, "I've taken care of things," and that voice she used when she was telling me something that mattered. She had known. She had set the trap 2 years before he sprung it. She had given him a chair by her fire and made the chair into a snare. "Let's help him close the deal," I said. We spent the next 3 hours setting it up. We weren't going to use a real buyer. I wasn't dragging some family from Mississauga into a federal investigation. Mr. Holloway had a corporate vehicle he sometimes used for private transactions, a numbered company registered in Ontario with a Bay Street nominee director, clean on paper, anonymous on a purchase agreement. We named the buyer entity Lakeside Northern Holdings. We drafted the offer, not $5 million, not 4.8. Desperate men get suspicious of round numbers and easy yeses. We pitched it at 4.6 million, all cash, 48-hour close. The reason we baked into the email was that the buyer was a Canadian-controlled private corporation parking proceeds before fiscal year end and needed the deal to register before March 31st for capital gains planning purposes. It was specific. It sounded like something a real numbered company would write. It explained the rush in a way that flattered him because it suggested someone richer than him was in a worse panic than he was. We sent it to the Kijiji-style FSBO listing he'd thrown together over the weekend, complete with grainy iPhone photos of my mother's kitchen. It took 14 minutes. My phone, still paired to the Den Hub, buzzed. I plugged in my earbuds. Sloan, his voice cracking, look at this. Sloan, his voice cracking. Look at this. 4.6 million. Cash. They want to close in 2 days. Take it, she said. Take it, take it, take it. No, he said. They're moving fast. Fast means scared. Scared means I can squeeze them. Of course he did. Mr. Holloway and I watched the email thread on his screen. The counter came back from the seller. 5 million flat or no deal. He's haggling, Mr. Holloway said. The man is committing wire fraud across provincial lines, and he is haggling. Let him win, I said. Make the price 5 even. Make him feel like he just outsmarted Bay Street. We sent the counter. 3 minutes later, the reply came in. Agreed. Send the agreement of purchase and sale. We close Friday at 10 a.m. at our solicitor's office on University Avenue. I looked at Mr. Holloway. The trap wasn't set. He had walked into it, sat down, and asked for the Wi-Fi password. Friday morning came in with the kind of low, gray Toronto sky that makes everything look like a 1990s music video. The closing was scheduled for 10 at the offices of a small boutique firm Mr. Holloway used on University near Queen's Park. The kind of office with hush carpet and Inuit prints in the lobby and a partner who could pour you a cup of coffee while a man's life was being legally undone in the next room. I wasn't in the closing room. Not at first. I was in a black SUV across the street with one of Mr. Mound, Holloway's articling students, and a small monitor on my lap, watching a feed from a button camera pinned to the lapel of the buyer's lawyer. At 9:52, a Lincoln pulled up to the curb. He stepped out. He was wearing the navy Hugo Boss suit my mother had bought him for a benefit at the AGO 3 years ago. It used to fit him. Now it's strained at the buttons. But he buttoned it anyway, like a man closing the biggest deal of his life. Sloan got out of the passenger side, scrolling on her phone. I zoomed in. She wasn't looking at flight options. She was already on a Sandals Antigua page comparing swim-up suites. They walked into the building like they owned the elevator. In the conference room, the buyer's lawyer, a man named Mr. Kessler, stood and shook his hand. Thank you for accommodating our client's timeline. The board has been very anxious to have this closed before quarter end. Happy to help, my mother's husband said, with the booming voice he used on people he thought were beneath him. He sat down. He drummed his fingers. There was a sweat ring already forming through the back of the Hugo Boss, between his shoulder blades. He looked at the bottle of Esca on the table and didn't drink. Mr. Kessler slid a stack of documents across. We have the wire ready to release on completion of the title transfer. 5 million Canadian. We'll need the executed deed and your statutory declaration, please. He reached into his briefcase. His hand trembled, but he covered it by smoothing his tie. He pulled out the quitclaim. He laid it on the table like he was laying down a winning hand. Mr. Kessler picked it up, scanned it, nodded politely. Title looks clean. Just a few questions for the record. You inherited the property from your late wife? Yes. And there are no other parties with a beneficial interest? No children of the deceased? He didn't even hesitate. There's a stepdaughter. Estranged. She's had some struggles, substance issues, unfortunately. She signed over her interest months ago in exchange for a settlement. We've all moved on as best we can, sitting in the SUV across the street. I watched my mother's husband, on a high-definition feed, in a Bay Street boardroom, calmly tell a lawyer that I was a junkie who'd sold her own inheritance for drug money. The same man who'd eaten my mother's lasagna every Sunday for 9 years. I watched my reputation get spent like loose change to make a $5 million fraud go down smoother. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just made a small note on my phone. Defamation. Add it to the file. Mr. Rem Eat. Kessler nodded solemnly, like a man who had heard sad family stories before and wasn't going to ask follow-up questions. He slid the bill of sale and the statutory declaration across. He signed both. Confidently, with a flourish. He smiled. Mr. Rov. Kessler picked up his desk phone and said, "Release the wire, please." That was the cue. The conference room door opened. I walked in. Mr. Holloway behind me. Behind him, A constable from Toronto Police Service in plain clothes, and a forensic investigator from the OPP's anti-rackets branch who'd been working a Tarrant file for 8 months and had been waiting for a Christmas present like this one. His entire career. For one full second, my mother's husband didn't recognize me. His brain refused to process me. I saw it in his eyes, the same look a deer gets when it hears the rifle bolt. Then he laughed. He actually laughed. "You can't be here," he said. "You can't be here," he said. "You signed away your interest. You're not supposed to be here." "I didn't sign anything," I said. "I never have. You know that." I sat down across from him. I slid a copy of Clause 7 across the table. Then Clause 8. He looked at them. He looked at the lawyer. He looked at Sloane, who had gone white under her bronzer. "This is your wife's actual will," I said. "The one that was registered in 2024. The one that gave you a life interest. You could have lived at the cottage rent-free for the rest of your life. You could have died in that bed. I would have brought you groceries. I'm not a monster." I leaned in. "But under Clause 8, the second you signed that bill of sale 10 minutes ago, you forfeited every right you ever had to that property. Title vests in me automatically. You don't live there anymore. You don't even have permission to stand on the dock. As of 9:58 this morning, you were a guest at my cottage. As of 10:04, you're a trespasser." The constable stepped forward. "Sir, we'll need you to remain seated." My mother's husband finally looked at the wire confirmation on Mr. Kessler's screen. The transfer status had flipped from pending to frozen, then to under investigation. $5 million, the OPP investigator said gently, moved across provincial lines on the strength of a forged document to settle a debt to a person of interest in an organized crime file. That's wire fraud under Section 380 of the Code, and that's organized crime offenses under Section 467. The Crown is going to have a lot to choose from. Sloane stood up. She tried to walk to the door. The constable said, "Ma'am, sit down." She kept walking. The constable said it again, not loudly. She sat. The investigator pulled out an iPad and turned it toward her. The footage from the den was already queued up. 11:47, the night before the funeral. Her own voice, asking if it would fly. Her own face, lit blue by the Caol Ila bottle. "We also have," the investigator said, "an inventory we executed at the cottage this morning of items belonging to the deceased that were removed without the executor's consent, including a pearl choker, 2-strand akoya, ruby clasp, currently being held by you." Her hand went to her neck. "Don't," I said. "Don't touch it. That's evidence now." He started begging. He called me his daughter. He had never called me that when my mother was alive. He called me his wife's kid, or by my first name, but never that. He used the word now like it was a coin he could flip into a fountain. "I'm your dad, sweetheart. I raised you. Don't do this. Please. They'll kill me. The Tarrants will actually kill me." "You don't understand." I stood up. I looked down at him. "You weren't my father. You were a man who slept in my mother's house. You were a tenant. And as of 4 minutes ago, your tenancy is terminated." The constable cuffed him at the wrist while he was still sitting in the chair because he wouldn't stand up. They had to lift him by the elbows. Sloane was cuffed standing, the choker still around her neck, until the investigator carefully unhooked it with gloved fingers and dropped it into an evidence bag. I watched them lead the two of them down the hall toward the elevator. Sloane was crying. He wasn't. He was talking fast at the constable, trying to explain about the Tarrants, about the urgency, about how he'd cooperate, about how he had names. The constable nodded the way constables nod when they're not really listening. When the elevator doors closed, Mr. Holloway put a hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. 3 months later, I was up at the cottage on a Tuesday afternoon. The locks had been changed. The Escalade hadn't come back. The Tarrant file took down 4 people that weekend, my mother's husband included. Sloane took a plea, 18 months, and a long list of conditions. The wire was fully unwound. The numbered company was dissolved on paper, the way these things are. I sat on the dock with my feet in Lake Muskoka. The pearls were in my pocket, clean now, in a little fabric pouch. I didn't put them on, not yet. I just held them in my hand. The thing nobody tells you about revenge is that it doesn't feel like fireworks. It doesn't even feel like satisfaction, really. It feels like a door clicking shut on a room you don't have to enter anymore. He spent his life signing things. A marriage certificate, a power of attorney he never deserved, a quitclaim deed that wasn't his to sign, a bill of sale that, the second the ink touched the paper, lifted him off my mother's land like a hand lifting a chess piece. He thought he was selling a cottage. He was signing the eviction notice, his own, and the ink, like the man said, was already starting to disappear. I've thought about that morning on the dock a lot in the months since. The pearls in my pocket, the water flat as a mirror, the strange quiet of a place that had finally stopped belonging to the wrong person. What I keep coming back to isn't the closing room or the constable, or even the look on my mother's husband's face when he realized the chair he'd been sitting in had a trap door under it. What I keep coming back to is how every single thing he lost, he handed over himself. Nobody took the cottage from him. Nobody took the $5 million. Nobody took his freedom, or Sloan, or his name. He gave them all away, one signature at a time, and he did it because he believed his own version of who he was, a clever man, a winner, the smartest one in any room he walked into. My mother had seen through that costume the second time around. She'd married him anyway, because she wanted to believe people could grow. But she also wrote Clause 8, because she wasn't naive about who he'd be the day she stopped watching. That's the part that still gets me. She loved him enough to leave him a chair by the fire. She knew him well enough to make that chair contingent on him sitting still. Cause and effect. Plain as that. He chose the path. The will just held the door open. I didn't beat him by being meaner than he was. I beat him by being patient when every part of me wanted to scream in that driveway in Bracebridge. I beat him by writing things down in a notebook for 7 months while I sat next to my mother's bed at Sunnybrook. I beat him by paying attention to the boring stuff. The e-transfers, the numbered companies, the smart system everyone forgot I'd installed. There's nothing magical about that. It's just the slow work of refusing to be the kind of person who looks away because looking is uncomfortable. If you take anything from what I've told you, take this. When somebody shows you who they really are at the worst moment of your life, believe them. Don't argue with the evidence in front of you. Don't soften it because they used to make you pancakes. But don't blow your life up reacting to them either. Walk to your car. Drive somewhere quiet. Open your laptop. Build the file. The people who try to erase you are almost always already busy erasing themselves, and the kindest thing the world ever does is give them enough rope and a long afternoon. My mother's last gift wasn't the cottage. It wasn't even the will. It was the quiet lesson that grief and clear thinking can live in the same body at the same time, that you can mourn somebody at 3 a.m. and still spot a forged signature at 3:01. That softness and steel aren't opposites. They're the same muscle, just used on different days. I keep the pearls in a drawer now. I wear them sometimes. They're heavier than they look.